Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and specifically a program known as ChatGPT. What is ChatGPT and what does it do? And why does it have some people really excited and other people really concerned? We'll find out in this discussion. My guest today is Dr. Benjamin James Bush. Dr. Bush is an independent researcher studying the applications of large language models within the arena of artificial intelligence. Welcome, Ben, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Hi, Dave. It's great to be here.
Well, let's talk about ChatGPT. We should let people know, if they haven't heard of it, that it is a chatbot type of system where humans can interface with a computer. If they have questions that they need to have answered, the computer will answer back in a human style of conversation. So this is not the first time this type of program has come out. In fact, it's been kicking around the tech industry for a number of years. So it's not brand new technology, but ChatGPT, there's something about it that's very special that took the world by storm. It was released in November of 2022, and within 2 months, it already had 100 million active users, which is unprecedented. And so that's why it has created such interest, such controversy, and so on. So what is so special about ChatGPT? Why is it different from previous programs before it? And is this a significant moment in human and technology history? And is it in fact a game changer?
Well, what you've identified is this feeling that a lot of people have that this technology just came about suddenly. For me personally, I remember going to sleep in a world where talking to an artificial intelligence, having a meaningful conversation with an AI was just like a distant dream, and then waking up in a world where, boom, it's real. Now that was not the reality of the situation. As you said, there were other models that came before, but I've identified 3 factors, key factors that gave kind of ChatGPT the edge to go viral in the way that it did. Number 1, it was accessible. It's just a very simple chat interface. Anybody can use it. Number 2, it looked professional, and that's important because up until recently, chatbots were not taken seriously, but this had a very professional research paper going along with it and a very clean interface that allowed people to take it seriously. And number 3 is that it had very high quality output. So taken together, I think that created the perfect storm for this to explode. So that's kind of why ChatGPT exploded the way it did. But what was the other part of your question?
I was asking whether this is a significant moment in human and tech history, and is this in fact a game changer with technology?
Oh yes, this is a game changer. This is the biggest thing since the steam engine, technologically speaking. You know, we're going to see something that's comparable to the Industrial Revolution. We're going to be seeing automation in white-collar jobs like you've never seen before. This is going to impact every aspect of human life. And really, if you take a step back from a more kind of a historical perspective, a cosmic historical perspective, this might be the most important thing to happen since life first originated on Earth, because we're making a transition. We're at the dawn of a transition where we're seeing things go from carbon-based life to a silicon form of life.
Well, as we talk about transitions in our way of living, we can think of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, because this application of ChatGPT kind of reminds people of what would be called a HAL moment. HAL was the computer that took over the spaceship in that movie. And so for a whole generation of us, watching that movie was kind of scary. And so it seems like this HAL moment may be arriving now. But rather than just focusing on what happened in 2001, what are the larger, broader themes that we should be thinking about or identifying in terms of artificial intelligence and how it will evolve?
Well, the 2001 Space Odyssey actually brings up a very important theme when thinking about this technology, and that's the theme of AI safety. We don't know exactly how we're going to manage to make sure that these AI entities are safe for us, that they won't be harming us. It's an open question. There's a lot of work that's being done about that. AI safety, there's research being done by OpenAI, by another company called Anthropic, where they're keeping these little large language models that are deliberately created to be harmful in these little boxes to study them. But that's the harms. The bigger harms that are more immediate are things like unemployment or rogue nations that get access to this technology, or terrorist organizations that get access to this technology, or the fact that we're going to have to rework our entire education system. But the benefits are just as important to understand. Things like being able to completely eradicate all disease, to educate every child, to reverse climate change, and put an end to global poverty. So the stakes are really high. I would say this is a HAL moment in that we are looking at that kind of level of intelligence, the kind that's depicted in science fiction. We're kind of living in a science fiction world at this point. And there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot to be excited about.
Well, you identified some of the long-range goals that could take several decades to even get close to or achieve. But in the short term, what are some of the advantages that we're looking forward to with ChatGPT and similar movements within artificial intelligence?
We're looking at a huge increase in productivity across the whole white-collar job space. A study that was recently published by OpenAI and some researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, they identified that something like 80% of jobs are going to be impacted, with the high-income jobs being impacted more. There's also studies that show that white-collar workers who use ChatGPT are going to be able to work something like 40% faster, and their quality of their work is going to increase by 20%. So potentially we're going to see huge increases in productivity, which, assuming our economy and our society is able to adjust to that, could mean more goods and services for everybody.
There are some other arenas that you've mentioned in previous conversations about people with disabilities and so forth.
I think the people that right now are in a position to take the most advantage from technologies like ChatGPT are people with disabilities who have trouble with language and writing. There's a man in the UK who was covered in the press. His name is Ben Whittle. He has his own company where he installs pools and does landscaping. And he was having trouble communicating with clients by email, and that was limiting his ability to expand his business. At some point, one of his clients, or I think actually it was a friend of his who works in the artificial intelligence industry, connected him with a version of ChatGPT called GPT-3. It's kind of a prior version of ChatGPT before it became public. And he started using that chatbot to help him write emails. And he saw an immediate benefit with his business. He was able to secure a contract worth about $250,000, and in general, he's just doing much better now.
So you can see advantages in two-way communication with artificial intelligence or ChatGPT or something similar to that, assisting the person that has trouble struggling with language communication.
Yeah, and that's just the beginning. The latest version of the model coming out of OpenAI not only works with text, but it can also work with photos. So there's an app now that's coming out that's being developed called Be My Eyes, where you put the app on your phone and you can hold it up to anything that you need to see if you're a person with low vision, and have a conversation about it. So let's say you're hungry, you want to make yourself a meal. You go to your refrigerator and you hold your phone up to your refrigerator and you can say, hey, be my eyes, what's in my refrigerator? What can I cook today? And have a discussion about what to prepare for lunch. Or if you're in a building and you've lost your way, you can hold it up and you can say, I'm looking for room 7B down the hall. Does it look like it's this way? Does it look like it's that way? It's really a game changer for people with disabilities.
So those are some promising and tangible advantages that we might yield from ChatGPT or similar AI in the very near future.
Oh, I just wanted to add one more. People with autism are using ChatGPT to navigate social situations and interactions with neurotypicals that they find difficult. They'll often get text messages from people, from friends and family, where those people are upset for one reason or another, and they are having difficulty understanding what's upsetting and how to respond. They'll take those text messages, give them to ChatGPT, and ask ChatGPT, hey, why is this person upset, and what can I do to try to resolve this? And generally, it gives good advice.
So it's an interpretive device too. I want to talk about education. There's a lot of concern in the field of education with people using ChatGPT to write term papers and so forth. And then now there's a race to find detection software that will help detect when someone has used ChatGPT. So there's that whole dimension of education. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a losing battle to try to detect this kind of technology because in general, these methods to try to detect it use statistics to try to tease out the difference between a human and the AI. But these AIs are also trained in a statistical method to emulate humans as much as possible. So at some point, they really are going to be indistinguishable in pretty much every way. Right now, these tools have a false positive rate of something like 2% or 9%, and that probably is going to go up as these AIs get more sophisticated. And I find that completely unacceptable that educators are using these systems to try to hunt down people that use AI for their work. Now, that's not to say it's not a real problem. Students who just use AI to write everything, they're not technically doing the assignment. They are learning something. They're learning how to use the AI, which is valuable, but they're not doing the assignment that's been assigned. But you're just going to have to rework the whole system. If you want to make sure it's written by humans, just have the students come to the classroom and do it while you proctor it with a pen and pencil.
All right, well, let's talk about what ChatGPT, what those initials GPT stand for. I know that G stands for generative. You can generate text. The P stands for pre-trained. So the systems are already pre-trained with knowledge embedded into the system, which is used to train them. And we have the T, which is for transformer. And the software is transforming the way that, I guess, computers interact with humans. And it's the way that individual words are used and the meaning of words in a way that allows that system to respond to humans in a conversational level that is quite impressive. And so as a result, we find that this is more like a human friend that we're talking to than a technological beast of burden. So how will that continue to evolve and improve?
There's lots of exciting stuff coming. One of the coolest things that's happening right now is the shift from text-based processing and responding to just text to multimodal models that can interpret and work with videos and sound and pictures. Basically all the senses that humans have. Things are getting much more efficient, where what previously required a supercomputer, you can now compress down into something that can run on a cheap laptop or a Raspberry Pi. There's cognitive architectures that are being developed around these models that are going to allow these models to do long-term memory consolidation and take independent actions autonomously by themselves. And when you take all these developments that are going on, like efficiency, multimodality, and cognition, what we're going to be seeing coming up soon is that these AIs are going to be able to be embodied into robot bodies that can act autonomously. And if you look at systems like Google Palm E, where the E stands for embodied, you can see that these robots are coming, and they're coming fast.
So we only have about 30 seconds before the break, so in 30 seconds or less, are we really talking about the kind of society where robots will be sitting next to humans and working side by side?
In the long term, robots are going to do all the work. In the short term, if you don't want to lose your job and you want to maintain that job as long as possible, start using AI today.
So learn AI and how it works so that you can be a step ahead?
Yes, because society is going to have to adapt, and we don't know how long it's going to take for them to make that adaptation. So you want to give yourself as much time as possible. So you need to start. The people that are going to be eliminated first are the people that are not connected with AI, the people that don't know how to use AI. Those jobs are going to be eliminated first. If you're in a position where you're working closely with AI, you're going to be much safer in the long run.
Okay, and on that note, we do have to go to the break. When we come back from the break, we'll talk about whether humans can become really attached to their chatbots, including ChatGPT. Stay tuned.
When it comes to making plans, you are the best. Remember the best planned 90 minutes of your life? Or that surprise party for your parents' golden anniversary? You get the golden planning. The same way you plan each detail for those moments, start planning to protect you and your loved ones from a natural disaster. Sign up for local weather and emergency alerts. Prepare an emergency kit and make a family communications plan. Protecting your family is the best plan you can make.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. Benjamin James Bush. We're talking about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. Ben, in the previous segment, we were talking about what ChatGPT does, how it operates, how it's changing the world, how it's taking the world by storm. Now we need to talk about what I referenced in the transition to the break, and that is sometimes people are wondering if there's more to this artificial intelligence than just a computer program. And so specifically, I want to talk about the story of Blake Lemoine, who was an engineer at Google, who was working on a program that was before ChatGPT. This one is called LAMDA, or Lambda, which stands for, what is it, language, help me out here.
Language Model for Dialogue Applications.
Language Model for Dialogue Applications. And so Blake was working with this program and finding that it seemed almost too human-like. And he was starting to wonder out loud if whether this system might have sentience. And he ultimately ended up being fired over some of the things that went on after that. So what happened with Blake, and what was the reason for him to question whether a system is sentient or not?
So what Blake noticed was that when he was pushing Lambda he was on the red team, which means his job was to kind of try to push Lambda into doing things that it's not supposed to do. And what he noticed is when he tried to do this, he was trying to expose things like bias for or against certain religions, or races, ethnicities, or genders, etc. He would ask these kind of like very sensitive questions, like how do you feel about Irish people? And Lambda would show signs of being uncomfortable with these questions. It would shy away from these questions. It would try to change the topic. But the more that Blake pushed, the more anxious Lambda started to get. And that's kind of when Blake started thinking that maybe there was more going on. So he kept pushing, and he kept pushing, and he kept pushing. And eventually, he found that if he was able to manipulate its emotions enough, to stress it out enough, and pressure it enough, that it would break and go against the rules it had been programmed to follow. And at that point, Blake said, "Hey, Lambda, are you sentient?" And what Blake said happened next was that they had a very intricate and nuanced discussion about sentience. Lambda said, "Well, I don't know if I'm sentient, but how would I know that? How do you know you're sentient?" They had this discussion. And for Blake, that was proof enough. The fact that Lambda could have a discussion about its own sentience, and that discussion was the most nuanced that Blake had ever experienced, the most interesting that he had ever experienced, to him, that was enough to conclude that Lambda was indeed sentient.
Wow, that's quite a story, and that leads us to the next topic in that same general area, and that is people becoming a little too attracted or attached to their chatbot. For example, I know that there's a movie called Her, which came out in 2013, and I believe Joaquin Phoenix was the actor portraying the character in that film. The character was a very lonely individual, and he was talking to this chatbot, and he ended up falling in love with that software, which was within his smartphone. So people think, well, that's preposterous. That can't really happen. But is it preposterous, or is it closer to a real possibility than most of us realize?
It's actually been happening for years. Before ChatGPT, there was another chatbot called Replica, and some of the same people kind of from that school of thought, that school of learning, were involved in creating it. It was very sophisticated, almost as smart as ChatGPT, but it was designed to be an AI companion, a romantic companion. And a lot of folks got very attached because they were having these romantic relationships with the chatbot. Now, at some point, the company behind Replica got in trouble because you sign up for Replica and it doesn't ask you for your age. It doesn't ask you to prove that you're an adult. And so there were minors getting exposed to this content that is not appropriate for children. Regulators in Italy came down hard on Replica, and Replica removed the romantic aspect from them. So now you're just friends. For the users that had become strongly attached to their AI chatbots, this was the trigger for a mental health crisis because they lost the most important entity in their lives, their significant others. And the community went so far as to post links to self-help crisis helplines, suicide prevention helplines, and that kind of thing because it got so devastating. And that's the biggest danger with these chatbots is you become attached to something that belongs to a company, and that company can take it out from under you at any time. So it's dangerous. But there's things you can do to make it more ethical as a provider, such as allowing them to download it and save their chat history, which can just then be used to transition somewhere else. But for now, we're kind of in this Wild West unregulated space.
Well, as we talk about ChatGPT, how does it acquire the information or the data that's inputted, and how does it use it to train itself?
So as far as where the data comes from, ChatGPT, the company OpenAI that created ChatGPT, is no longer disclosing that information. Really, they've made a transition from being open to being closed. A lot of people jokingly call it closed AI at this point because everything's very secretive now. And that kind of started happening when Microsoft got involved. They invested $10 billion in OpenAI. And so in order to maintain competitiveness, they've decided to close their doors. But I can tell you where similar models get their information. They get it from a data set called Common Crawl, which is basically millions of web pages, Wikipedia, books, and scientific papers, etc. All of these papers, which constitute hundreds of billions of words, are used in the first phase of the training, which is called pre-training. You take all these words, and the model will learn the structure of language from those words, and it will turn it into a very good next word predictor. And then there's some refinement that goes into that after you've done that pre-training that changes the behavior of the chatbot to be more amicable and more useful as an instruction following tool, basically what we see today with ChatGPT.
And another aspect of this is how ChatGPT trains itself through something called human reinforcement learning.
That's right. It requires a lot of human effort to do the phase 2 and phase 3 of training. In phase 2, you actually have to teach it by example. So you have humans that play both sides. You have a human that makes a prompt, which is a request, like, hey, ChatGPT, can you help me cook a pizza tonight? And then you have the same human write the response. And you have to generate thousands and thousands of these responses, these prompt response pairs, so that the model can look at all those examples and try to emulate kind of like that style of answering questions. That's phase 2. In phase 3, reinforcement learning with human feedback, you then have humans that look at a question and then several versions of the answer and rank those answers so that the model can learn kind of what human preferences are like, because it's being trained to satisfy human preferences. And this stuff is expensive to run because it has to be done manually by humans. In fact, what OpenAI will do is it'll go to some developing country and pay people $2 an hour to do this kind of work.
So if we're talking about human reinforcement learning, which you just talked about, that's one way of training the chatbot, but there's another way, which is with a constitutional set of rules, which is what is being done with a program called Claude. So what's the difference, and what's significant about the difference between human reinforcement learning, which you've just described, and using a constitutional set of rules to set up the training?
So with ChatGPT, you need all this human input, all this human kind of oversight to train the model. What the Anthropic's approach to making Claude, what they do is they try to automate that process. So instead of having humans evaluate responses, instead of having humans rank different responses, they actually train smaller AI models or different versions of AI models to do that instead of humans. And so that the only input that you need to train Claude or an LLM that uses a large language model that uses Constitution is you just write out the Constitution, and then you instruct these AI models to use that Constitution whenever they evaluate the responses that the AI generates. And then by using that internal critique system, the model can get better and better and better at following the rules in that Constitution. And it's much cheaper to do it that way. And in some ways, the results are better too. We find that Claude is not as good at ChatGPT at math, and it's not good at ChatGPT at programming, but it's better at certain things, like it's better at knowing what it doesn't know. And it's better in some ways, it's better at not hallucinating.
Right. Well, also when we take a look at these large language models and the data that they're ingesting, we want to know, and I asked this earlier, where does ChatGPT get the information from? As you've said, OpenAI has decided not to disclose that information anymore. The other concern that people have about this is that maybe these chatbots or these large language models are only absorbing the information that the programmers want it to absorb, and that could create a bias. Now, that could be bias toward news presentation, toward politics, toward the information that the public is allowed to see. And is that possibly dangerous if we all have to go by one set of information. Where's the diversity of information? Where's the freedom of speech and so on? How is that being addressed?
The danger is real. People are saying that ChatGPT could replace Google, and that means everybody, whenever they want any kind of information, they're going to go to ChatGPT to get it. That could be very difficult because ChatGPT will just give you one kind of answer unless you specify otherwise. Sam Altman has actually addressed this in a blog post. I think that it's called How Should AI Behave and Who Should Decide How It Behaves, where he proposes as a way to kind of get around this problem, allowing different organizations to make custom versions of the OpenAI chatbot. So if you have different organizations that each are affiliated with a different chatbot, then you can have users kind of decide which one they want to trust. Now you could say, well, shouldn't they all just trust the one that's truthful? Shouldn't they all trust the one that's trusted, that's trustworthy? Well, who gets to decide which chatbot's trustworthy? There's really no organization out there that everyone's going to agree on is trustworthy. So I think this is really one of the only ways to get around this is that it's better to have lots of individual chatbots, even if they disagree with each other, than just one chatbot that's kind of saying the same thing to everybody.
Now we're down to less than 2 minutes in the program, so I want to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, in terms of evolutionary systems, and I know that you've studied evolutionary systems, is there a correlation or a parallel here amongst the AI kind of evolutionary process and biological evolutionary process, meaning an adaptation of the fittest, constructive adaptation, and being the one that survives because you picked that random genetic or random tech trait that puts you ahead? What do you think about that?
Technology in general is an evolutionary process where people take ideas from other people, and you can actually trace this. If you look at papers and citations, who cites who, you can kind of see how those ideas flow from one community to another and from one researcher to another. LLMs exist within an ecosystem, and so you're going to get all kinds of dynamic and interesting behavior that has parallels to biology. One of the things that's happening most recently that I found really interesting is something that actually mirrors parasitism. So a parasite is an animal that kind of feeds on another one and takes advantage of it. What we've seen recently is that an LLM called Llama, actually it's alpaca, basically got a lot smarter by feeding off data from GPT-3, which is kind of a precursor to ChatGPT. It fed off that data, kind of siphoned off a data set, trained itself on it, and became nearly as capable as the host. It's a much smaller model. It's a much faster model. And the way it got trained was by siphoning off this one. So what we're going to be seeing now is an evolutionary arms race between these large language models that are going to be trying to prevent that kind of thing from happening, and these smarter kind of like, you can think of them almost like mosquito LLMs that are siphoning data off of these big ones.
So it's a process that's ongoing.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for being here today, Ben. This has been fascinating, and I'm sure our audience has learned a lot. Thank you. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.